I grew up in a very Christian environment. My mom was a devout Christian. My grandparents were Christians. My cousins were Christians. My best friend was a Christian. I went to church every Sunday. I went to youth group every Wednesday and sometimes Sunday. And to top it all off, I went to a private Christian school for 3 years. For the first 15 years of my life, I was a pretty solid young earth creationist. And at age 15, after one biology class where we learned about the theory of evolution, I was inspired. I believed that evolution and the Big Bang were false, and I believed the earth was not billions of years old. But I didn't know why any of it was false, so I decided to look it up. I distinctly remember the very first Google search I typed in: evidence against evolution. The irony of trying to get at truth by starting with a conclusion and doing everything in my power to prove that conclusion didn't hit me until a bit later. After looking up some evidence against evolution, along with some evidence against an old Earth and the Big Bang, and getting some pretty handy resources, most notably Answers in Genesis, True.origins, Creation.com, and Creation Wiki. I felt like I had gotten all the information I needed. Evolution didn't happen. And I had resources from people with their PhDs who agreed and wrote at length about it. But one question kept creeping up in my mind. Why, if there are so many lines of evidence that show evolution and an old Earth and the Big Bang to be false, do the vast majority of scientists accept them as true? Now, I was at least smart enough to realize that just because a majority of people believe something, that doesn't mean it's true. But the question still calls out for an answer. It's still a valid question. Why do the majority of scientists accept these things? The websites I regularly visited, along with pretty much everyone close to me, had an answer to this. We live in an America that has become far more secularized than it used to be. We've fallen away from God and His Word, the Bible. And as a result, we've been looking for explanations about the universe that have nothing to do with God. But God did create the universe, so any explanation that doesn't include God will have to be very mistaken. That is why the majority of scientists accept evolution, because they're trying to explain the universe without God. This answer was like a midday snack. It tides you over for a bit, but it's obvious you'll be hungry again before long. Even at the time, I remember being unsatisfied with this response. Was I really prepared to believe that the majority of scientists suppressed evidence against evolution because of some anti-God bias? Isn't the whole point of science to explore the unknown and learn new things? Isn't that why lots of people become scientists in the first place? And also, I've heard it said many times that people reject God and Christianity because they simply don't want to abide by God's rules, or they don't want their sin exposed, or something along those lines. But this just didn't make sense of my experiences with other non-Christians. When I asked my non-Christian friends why they weren't Christians, they typically responded with something like, well, why should I be a Christian? Or, I've never had any reason to be one. And I never got the impression that they were hiding anything from me. To me, the idea that the vast majority of scientists were implicitly anti-God and actively wanted to explain the world without reference to God sounded more like a conspiracy theory than anything else. This especially didn't make sense in light of the Christian biologists who accepted evolution. Certainly, a Christian who believes in evolution is not anti-God. And if they are, they probably have no clue what Christianity is. That said, humans are notorious for their ability to hold inconsistent beliefs. So the mere presence of Christians who accept evolution isn't proof that Christianity and evolution actually are compatible. And indeed, I didn't think the two were compatible. But it supports the notion that, at the very least, some group of people accept evolution for reasons other than an anti-God bias. Maybe I'll dig deep into the topic of the so-called creation-evolution debate another time, but for now, I'll continue with the autobiography. During my layman's study of creation and evolution, I looked not only into the scientific issues, but also into an area of study known as biblical hermeneutics, which deals with how to properly interpret Bible passages. I did this because I'd heard of people who interpreted the creation account in Genesis differently than young Earth creationists, such as old Earth creationists or theistic evolutionists. Once again, my initial goal as a 15-year-old was to prove young Earth creationism right and its opponents wrong. But this changed over time as I realized ways in which these different interpretations actually seemed to make better sense and were less ad hoc or contrived than the young Earth creationist position. One day, around age 16 or 17, it hit me that if these interpretations, which don't conflict with evolution, were just as plausible as the interpretations which do, then the relationship between Christianity and evolution would be one of mystery or ignorance rather than conflict. That is, it would no longer be a case of Christianity versus evolution per se. It would be more a case of, well, maybe evolution conflicts with Christianity, but I have just as good reason to think that it doesn't. This line of thinking led me to a place which, had I been reasoning a little more objectively to begin with, I would have already gotten to. Because I thought evolution was in conflict with Christianity, and Christianity was such a big part of my life, I was very reluctant to seriously consider that evolution could be true. But now that I felt my Christianity wasn't inherently threatened by the theory of evolution, the barrier that prevented me from searching evidence for evolution on Google was greatly weakened. So that's exactly what I did. And when I did, I saw that the theory of evolution has some good evidence in its favor. While I was warming up to the possibility that evolution had actually taken place, I'd already begun asking other questions about Christianity, which all Christians ask themselves at some point or another. There are lots of other religions. How do I know I have the right one? Is there any evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? Or even the existence of God, for that matter? Over time, these questions became more significant to me, and I shifted my focus from the theory of evolution, which I now viewed as actually pretty plausible, to the existence of God. God might have used evolution as his method of creating, but God can't create anything if there's no God to do the creating in the first place. So I asked myself, how do you know God exists? And I didn't really know. I've never had any kind of supernatural or religious experience before. But I knew there were resources that could help me with the question. This time, however, I didn't fall into the same trap as before. I knew that my beliefs regarding evolution didn't change until I was willing to look at the side I really didn't feel like looking at. But all that info was there right from the start. It was only my unwillingness to seek it out that kept me from refining my own views. I knew that if I did only look at one side of the God debate, or any controversial debate for that matter, the thought of the other side potentially having info that could change my mind would haunt me forever, along with the thought that I wouldn't be giving the other side its fair trial. Anytime I thought, there's good reason to believe in God, it would have to be qualified with, but I've only looked at sources that say there's good reason to believe in God. Well, that's like listening to a debate and skipping past the person you disagree with every time they get up to speak. What's the point? No. This time, I wanted to do things better. I wanted to be as fair to atheism as I was to theism. This included finding some resources for atheism, as I had already done for theism. My research on the atheism-theism debate led to a very different result than my research on the creation-evolution debate. When I studied creation and evolution, I started on one side and largely ended up on the other side. I used to be a staunch young Earth creationist, but I ultimately came to accept evolution and also its compatibility with Christianity. On the other hand, after a couple years of looking into the God debate, I was left with an unsettling feeling of agnosticism. To my understanding, some of the arguments for the existence of God were pretty decent, like the contingency argument, which is still my favorite argument for the existence of God. But none of them proved beyond a reasonable doubt that God actually existed. And as a Christian, it's a little hard to center your life around someone, in this case, God, if there are doubts whether that person even exists. That said, I found the arguments against the existence of God even less convincing, so I never felt I had a good reason to think God doesn't exist. Through all of this, I would periodically reflect on myself and think, do you know what evidence it would take to convince you God does or doesn't exist? A few times I was asked this exact question by other people, and I truly didn't know. I thought it would be like love. When someone asks, how do you know you're in love? Another answers, you just know. I thought that once I got the right amount or strength of evidence, I would just know. But that feeling never came, and the more I researched, the more I saw a never-ending path. An argument is made, then a counter to that argument is made, then a counter to the counter to that argument is made. On and on, counters, 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 with each next counter requiring a little more familiarity with this or that subject that I knew nothing about, meaning I would have to study up on that subject. and all to show that one point made for a sub-argument of premise 2 of an argument was a good point. It finally got to a point where I had information overload, receiving too much info from too many conflicting sources about different topics. It was mentally exhausting. Not only did I have anxiety surrounding the God question, I had anxiety about pretty much everything, including death. The information overload, plus my anxiety, led to a very uncomfortable situation where the one thing I had the most passion for, philosophy, wasn't enjoyable anymore. Because I was fully agnostic by this time, I was used to thinking about death in a non-religious way. We die, we go back to nothing, oblivion, boom, that's it. But then, why am I putting so much effort into life? Seriously, what is the point? I got a very hollow feeling from this view of death, because nothing of permanence would be done. When the universe reaches heat death, all life will be gone, all feelings felt, and all thoughts thought. Then what? Nothing. That's it. The end. Death and the afterlife are important topics in philosophy. For me, they're some of the most fascinating things about philosophy. But to have such high levels of anxiety surrounding these topics made it impossible to ever want to think about them. Again, I want to stress that all I'm doing is telling you my story. I'm not saying you should view my thoughts as the right or wrong way to react to the situation. I'm just pointing out that these were, in fact, the thoughts I had at the time. Maybe you find this view of death perfectly fine. You're not alone. Some people find it liberating. I didn't. Around this time, my second year of college, I learned I was infected with Lyme disease. And the process of testing and treating my disease was not fun. It was definitely the worst experience of my life up to this point. The physical toll was an inconvenience, but the mental toll was insufferable. If you have anxiety and you get Lyme disease, the disease literally makes your anxiety worse. I was having multiple panic attacks daily. This time was significant because I'd already considered taking antidepressants for my anxiety in the past, but this was the straw that broke the camel's back. I started taking antidepressants. Now, you might be wondering what this has to do with the God question. Like I said, there was always anxiety in me about God and death. I viewed them as monumentally important, but I was scared. I don't know what happens after death. I don't know if there's a God. I felt lost, thanks in no small part to my anxiety. That's where my thinking about antidepressants comes in. I knew they would make me feel different. Would they make me feel different about God and death? If I was clinging to God or Christianity out of fear, and the antidepressants would make me less fearful, would I find myself more easily rejecting God and Christianity? Or if there was a correlation between my mood and my willingness to believe in God or Christianity, would antidepressants make me even more willing to believe? In all transparency, I thought the latter was more probable. that I would stop feeling as anxious and be okay with accepting Christianity despite there still being tons of uncertainty in my mind. The idea of something other than reason swaying me to a position on this matter was unacceptable to me. But it was also impossible to deny that if you change things in your brain, you change the way you perceive things. After I could tell the antidepressants had taken effect, so about 2 or 3 months after starting, my perspectives on things did change, but not for the reason I thought they might. Antidepressants increase serotonin, the chemical in the brain responsible for calmness and emotional stability, which is why I initially thought I'd be less bothered by doubts about God and Christianity, more willing to believe. Instead, what I was less bothered by was a nagging feeling that had been with me since I started looking into the topic in high school. The feeling that I wasn't giving atheism its fair trial. This feeling largely stemmed from my past experience with evolution, where my reluctance to seriously consider the evidence for evolution kept me from learning what I now take to be the truth on the matter. That idea didn't bring me the same uneasiness it used to. All throughout high school and into college, every time I heard some theist make a good point or argument, I immediately thought, but remember, you'd rather God exist than not, so maybe that's the reason you find their argument so convincing. Bringing this to mind can sometimes be a good reminder, especially if you don't think of it much as it is. But if this is the automatic response that you go to every single time, it can ironically hurt your ability to reason well. Even when I was purely agnostic, I still had these thoughts of, well, maybe you just believe that a theist made a good point because deep down you just would rather God exist than not exist. I'm reminded of C.S. Lewis's quote, "I was so far from wishful thinking that I hardly thought anything true unless it contradicted my wishes." That was the way I felt. Anyway, the antidepressants helped stop those automatic thoughts. They didn't and still don't stop me from taking a good hard look at my own personal preferences, what I want to be the case. Instead, they made it so those thoughts weren't automatic. My thoughts no longer worked like a reflex, where every time I thought a theistic argument was good, I immediately doubted myself. The antidepressants helped me realize just how much anxiety I had wrapped up in the question of God and death. In fact, when I felt the effects for the first time, I was nearly brought to tears because I couldn't help but think, is this what people normally feel like? I was feeling regular levels of serotonin, and my world, which had been a big ball of anxiety, was truly calm. When I felt this calmness, I was able to think clearer, less affected by my anxieties, and a few thoughts popped in my head, back and forth. It's actually pretty common for me to have internal back and forth discussions. I asked myself, why do you always treat yourself like the only reason you find theistic arguments good is that you want God to exist? Well, I responded to myself, I know that I'd rather have God exist than not, and I know it's not uncommon, and in fact it's pretty common, for people to be biased by their wishes. So I want to be sure I'm not biased. I asked myself another question. How are you going to tell if you're biased? And when I asked this, I had to think about it for a minute. How could you tell if your own self is biased? If you're biased, wouldn't you also be biased in your assessment of how biased you are? To be fair about everything, you would either have to look at yourself from the outside, like an object, or set up some kind of bias test, some standard against which you can compare yourself. And as a little teaser for the next episode, I can happily say there is a way to get an idea of your own bias. There truly is. But this episode has gone on long enough, so you'll have to go to the next episode if you want to learn what I did about detecting your own bias. My name is Daniel Hurd. Thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next time.